So I give the word over to you, Tim.
Thanks so much. And I'm another virtual participant, but delighted to at least be part of this virtually. And I'm going to build on what Tom and Christiana have just said and talk to you about some of the incredible positive tipping point opportunities we can seize together. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce what I mean by a tipping point, and I'm going to have to say something about the extraordinary risks we're running with crossing tipping points in the climate. So let's start with a little movie of a system that I'm pushing towards a tipping point. So it's a system with two different stable states. It's in the one on the left, the valley on the left, the ball rolling around. But what I'm doing to this system is making that state that it's started in, its familiar state, less and less stable over time. So some damping feedbacks that maintain the old status quo are getting weaker, and some amplifying feedbacks that can propel change are getting stronger. And there, at the tipping point, they get so strong, they create a change that's quite abrupt and self-propelling from one state of the system to the other at the tipping point. If you wanted a simpler example, you can always lean back on your chair to that balance point where you know that a small change makes a big difference to your state and fate as a system. But this pattern of tipping point behavior, it can happen in bad ways and good ways. So starting with the bad ways, there are a bunch of parts of our climate system, our life support system, if you like, that we know could cross a tipping point to an alternative state that would be more damaging for us. Just a few of them are sketched here, but you get the sense already quite a lot of them are clustered in the Arctic, and also that they have cascading consequences indicated by the arrows, where unfortunately tipping one part of the climate system, like losing the sea ice cover in the Arctic or the Greenland ice sheet, has consequences that can bring forward tipping of other parts of the system. And in a minute, I'll talk more about the great Atlantic overturning circulation that connects this system together. But what myself and hundreds of colleagues have been doing for years now is summarizing for the world, well, how close as well as how big are the risks we're running of crossing tipping points in the climate. And we reported on that in the autumn, in fact, told the world that we're crossing the first tipping point for the dieback of coral reefs in the tropics as the global temperature now heads close to 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level, a temperature level that sadly we're now destined to overshoot. And there are many of these tipping point risks I thought I could talk about, but for me in the UK and for you in Iceland, the one I'll briefly concentrate on is the great Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, or AMOC as we call it for short. Like all of those tipping points, we know if we keep pushing the global temperature up, the risk of crossing a tipping point in this crucial system is going to increase, and that the system is already at risk. What is the system? It's the great red to blue loop around the Atlantic that we're seeing here, where red are surface currents in the ocean, including the Gulf Stream, and blue are return currents at thousands of meters depth in the Atlantic Ocean. And this whole thing is driven by this process called deep water formation, kind of north of Iceland, if you like, and west and south of Iceland in two different regions where the surface waters of the Atlantic Ocean get cold enough and salty enough and therefore dense enough to sink from the top of the ocean to the bottom in simple terms and drive this great circulation. But tragically, we know that this circulation can be switched off and that's happened. It's been switched on and off 25 times just during the last ice age. And we know it's at risk from global warming and the associated melting of ice and snow in the Arctic that's adding both heat and fresh water into the surface waters of the North Atlantic, making them less dense, less prone to sinking. So why should you care if you're in Iceland or the UK? Well, we now know that in some of our models, we cross this tipping point at around 2 degrees of global warming. And remember, we're at 1.4 and heading through 1.5 shortly. And if if this is what happens in reality, then eventually we end up in a very different climate, especially winter climate for Iceland and for the UK. So if you look at the map on the right here, it shows how the Arctic sea ice would make a spectacular return in this world with a tipping point, because the Gulf Stream would no longer be coming to the UK or towards Iceland. It would turn right and go back past Spain. And so we'd lose a massive sort of source of heat carried by the ocean. And it means in the winter, the sea ice is surrounding Iceland. And in fact, it's surrounding a lot of the UK by the time we get to February. And that means if we ask what's the climate, the worst climate we get once every 10 years in this future world, well, it's pretty chilly in London in the winter. It's minus 20 degrees C and 3 frozen months of the year. But with you in Iceland, it would be minus 40 or minus 50 degrees C, depending on where you are, and at least half of the year with frozen solid, if not much longer. So I'm sure that would be challenging for you, just as it would be for us in the UK. And the point about a risk like this is it's existential. It's so damaging that we should be doing everything in our power to try and avoid it. Unfortunately, though, as we keep pushing up the global temperature, the window for preventing those damaging irreversible tipping points in the climate and in the biosphere is rapidly closing. We need to be doing everything in our power to limit what we call the overshoot of 1.5 degrees centigrade and the only way we can do that is, as I say, to activate positive tipping points. That's the only way to radically accelerate decarbonisation and nature regeneration. So what do I mean by a positive tipping point? I'm talking about exactly the same kind of concept I started with in that little model, but now we're thinking about shifting societies and technologies and our behaviors from an unsustainable state to a sustainable state, which you can picture each as like a valley with a hilltop between them. There are plenty of damping feedbacks that maintain the status quo. Most governments still subsidize the extraction and the consumption of fossil fuels, for example. But we know that a future powered by renewable energy, electrifying all the things we can, transforming our relationship with nature, that would have a lot of things stabilizing it as well. The crucial question and crucial point is that actions by some of us can change the shape of the landscape in a way that makes the unsustainable way of doing things less and less stable and can tip the system, be it a sector or a nation, to a different and more sustainable state. And I'll show you in a second that this is already happening. And you can see there I've written a book about some of the examples of it happening. But to persuade you that we can transform so fundamentally and quickly, I thought I'd go back into history, introduce you to my distant relative, Lillian Lenton, photographed here in 1913, in prison, as you can possibly tell by the number on her jacket and the rather bleak background, because she was one of the suffragettes and she'd just got caught red-handed for burning down the tea house in Kew Gardens in London with her accomplice, Olive Warry, one of many acts of arson that she perpetrated as part of the suffragettes' campaign for votes for women, for universal suffrage. And as an activist, she went straight on hunger strike as soon as she was put in prison. And the authorities did what they usually did with the hunger strikers, which was to start force feeding them pretty much on day one. But on day 3 of her incarceration, when they were force feeding Lillian, they put the tube down the wrong way into one of her lungs, poured in liquid food and nearly drowned her. She didn't die. But the state then covered up what had happened. They released Lillian from prison to the care of her friends, but the Home Secretary of the UK lied publicly about what had happened. And it became obvious quite quickly that he was lying. And this started to shift public opinion in this instance. towards sympathy for the suffragettes' cause, because like all militant activists, they weren't very popular at the time. This was actually one of many events we could cite that started to shift public opinion towards the cause of votes for women. And ultimately, of course, this very small group of people, this tiny fraction of society, was able to completely tip social norms for everyone, such that in the world afterwards, hardly anyone could believe there was a different world before where there wasn't equal voting rights for men and women, for women as well as men. So that's just a one little illustration from history. And if I stay about a century ago, I want to show you an example of how technology can tip and change super fast. So we're going to start by rewinding a little bit further to 1900, just to look at the Easter parade on Fifth Avenue in New York, in Manhattan, where all the rich people are out parading around on the sidewalk or parading around in the street. But in 1900, they're all parading around in horse-drawn carriages, except for one person who's in an early automobile. Can you spot that person in the photograph? If you've got a really good eye, you might have seen them somewhere near the middle there. But I want to fast forward 13 years to the time when Lillian had just been released from prison to the care of her friends after that awful incident. Over on the other side of the Atlantic, 1913, Easter Day Parade, Fifth Avenue, New York City. Now the challenge is to spot the one person left in a horse-drawn carriage. And if you've got a quick eye, you might have seen they're over here. But the point is, this is a radical tipping point in how people moved around. It had many, many repercussions, but the system tipped for a bunch of reasons. There were strong amplifiers in the system. The more cars got made, the better we got at making them. The more cars that got made, most famously the Model T, the cheaper they got and the more attractive they were to consume, and so on. Those amplifiers got so strong, the system tipped. And it's a common pattern for new technologies, including clean green technologies, that the more we adopt them, the more attractive, the more affordable, and the more accessible they get until they become the obvious option that everyone chooses. And indeed, markets are now tipping not to the gasoline car, but away from petrol and diesel cars to electric vehicles, and led as shown here by Norway. This is the tipping point, if you like, and what we call the S-curve change of the Norwegian market from everyone buying petrol and diesel cars before 2010 to everybody buying electric vehicles now. And interestingly, why Norway? Why Norway first? It's not just about technology. It's again about social activists. Only that you might recognize some of them in this case, photographed in 1989, because they're members of a very famous pop band, a-ha, including Morten Harket and his architect friend, who you'll never have heard of, Harald Rostvik. But they're pictured here with a hobby-converted electric vehicle, which they are going to import the following year to Norway. But their campaign to the Norwegian government includes 9 policy demands to make electric vehicles more attractive to the consumer to adopt, which including waiving the import registration tax for all electric vehicles, which was the first policy they got agreed to when they imported a white version of the car behind in 1990. They also tried to campaign for the waiving of road tolls and the waiving of VAT and so on and so forth. I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but suffice to say, they used to drive the white version of this electric vehicle around Oslo, go through the tolls, refuse to pay the tolls, eventually get the car impounded, and then it would come up at auction, but they would embarrass the authorities by all being sat there on the front row as a world-famous pop band with the media covering every move they made. And typically, somebody in the audience who they didn't even know would buy the car and then give it back to them so they could repeat the cycle, which they did throughout the 1990s 7 or 8 times until they got the Norwegian government to come round to their proposals, put in place a bunch of incentives to adopt electric vehicles. And that's why when major manufacturers put electric cars on the market around 2011, why the Norwegian market tipped ahead of the rest of the world. But But despite what you see going on one side of the Atlantic with the American situation and so on, if you look in the wider picture and the Asian markets, you'll find, hey, the Asian markets, China in particular, are already tipping to electric vehicles, as are many European markets. And this tipping point is becoming self-propelling and spreading across the world. And even ahead of that, we're seeing the tipping point to renewable energy, to solar power and wind power already as the cheapest form of electricity worldwide. There's a bunch of other activities and sectors that cause greenhouse gas emissions that we need to positively tip, and some are closer to the tipping point than others. But to finish up with an Icelandic example, I thought I wouldn't just talk about technology, but also about the need to tip. There it says nature positive farming and sustainable diets, but we also need to positively tip our relationship with nature and also avoid negative tipping points, like the famous case of the fact that, of course, some cod fisheries collapsed catastrophically. You in Iceland did a good job, in a sense, of introducing tradable permits in the 70s and avoiding the complete crash of fish stocks that happened famously off Newfoundland. But many other fisheries worldwide, of course, have collapsed, including in the North Sea, the fisheries for plaice and hake. But what I wanted to tell you to wrap up is that through policy to impose what's called maximum sustainable yield on the fisheries in the North Sea, we've actually seen a positive tipping point, a rapid recovery of at least the plaice and the hake stocks. Cod is a thornier problem. If you crash the cod fishery, that's a more complicated story. But the wider message is, even when we've destroyed or degraded nature, it has some capacity to bounce back. And if we work with it in the right way, we can positively tip recovery. So to wrap up, my message is, we can do it. We probably have to do it. It's only going to need a fraction of us, a committed fraction, to ultimately tip everyone to change. But we need to reach that critical mass to move, if you like, from catastrophe to prosperity. So basically, we've got to limit this overshooting of 1.5 degrees global warming to avoid an existential risk for Iceland and for the whole world. And it's going to take collective action, policies, bottom-up and top-down action to phase out fossil fuels, to regenerate nature, and to tip from facing those existential tipping point risks to seizing the positive tipping point opportunities. So I really hope that today is galvanizing some of the energy to do that together. And I think you'll hear some more great examples of tipping points that are starting to happen out of Iceland. Thank you.